I was first introduced to jobs to be done theory a few years ago, working at Dropbox. We essentially had been building a platform technology that was meant to solve a few specific use cases. And I found it really hard as a product manager to know what we should be solving for. For example, you can send a file to a client, but what are they really trying to get done as part of that process? I've been looking for a framework that would help me kind of provide some structure around what we should build and for whom and how important each part of that process was.
Hi, this is thrv's case study series. This is Jared Ranere, a partner with thrv, and I'm here with Jamie McCroskery, the founder of Bluebird. Today we're going to talk about using jobs to be done at startups, and specifically we're going to talk about how Jamie used jobs to be done to raise his seed round and how he's been using it since then. So let's introduce you, Jamie. Can you describe yourself, your company, what you do?
Yeah, sure. My name is Jamie. Thanks for the introduction, Jared. My background is in traditional technology at companies like Dropbox, and most recently at consumer brands like Glossier, working on the technology and product management side. While I was working at Glossier, I saw, their customers essentially asking for much more sustainable products, but that being a real challenge for the company to enact within their own supply chains. So I started a company called Bluebird Climate, which helps give brands the tools to make their products more sustainable in a way that's affordable and what customers want.
So I'd love to hear, what role has jobs to be done played in your work so far? So how did it, first of all, when did you start thinking about applying jobs to be done to what you're doing?
Yeah, I was first introduced to jobs to be done theory a few years ago, working at Dropbox. We essentially had been building a platform technology that was meant to solve a few specific use cases. And I found it really hard as a product manager to know what we should be solving for. For example, you can send a file to a client, but what are they really trying to get done as part of that process? So I had been looking for a framework that would help me kind of provide some structure around what we should build and for whom and how important each part of that process was. And the same thing was true at Glossier as well. People interact with consumer products for both functional and emotional reasons in jobs. And the interrelation of both of those was really important to get right. And another place I, really started relying on the jobs to be done theory. And for Bluebird in particular, what we're building here is ultimately product development and supply chain software, which is very complex. And I knew that in order for us to find the right wedge into the market and a real opportunity, we were going to have to provide some structure around it. Enterprise customers are different than mid-market customers, which are different than SMBs. There are different roles in all of these companies. They all have different needs. So we actually started from the beginning in our problem mapping to say, what do we want this company to be around? We roughly know this space is important to sustainability and supply chain and product development, but what specifically are we going to build and how big is the opportunity? That's when we first started digging into the job to be done theory and applying it.
So you used it for segmentation, for market sizing, to figure out if the opportunity was big enough, and you also used it to identify specific customer problems to go after. Is that right?
That's exactly right. So I'm actually thinking about our pitch deck. We had a few slides in there that had to explain where the need was, what problems we were solving, and job. I essentially had a very, very high level abridged job map that showed this fiery pain point that we discovered in the long process of bringing a product to market. And that aligned with our growth opportunities to say, hey, we're going to solve this problem at the beginning of the job for this customer, and that's going to afford us all these opportunities down the line. And helped also provide a market sizing around that to say, hey, if we do build this, how big is this market? And it was really important for us in particular because, again, this market is so complicated. And it's if you think about pitching a traditional SaaS or marketplace investor, they're not very ramped up on sustainability, which is a very complicated subject. They're not ramped up on supply chains and physical products. So being able to simplify that into a structure that communicates those complicated, very arcane things in a simple way was important for us to even be able to have a shared language. They understood the opportunity we were looking at.
That's super interesting. Yeah, I mean, I'm just thinking about if you Google, startup fundraising pitch deck, you're gonna find out very quickly that the first thing you have to do is establish the problem and then establish that the market size for solving that problem is big enough to warrant a VC investment, right? And so it sounds like partly what you're saying is if you just jumped straight to the problem, like mid-market CPG companies or beauty companies or retail, whatever you call them, they struggle with this. People wouldn't even know what you were talking about because sustainability is kind of a niche field. There's a lot of language around it that people don't understand. The processes to become sustainable, they don't understand. And so you use the job to educate potential investors on what this world is and how to think about the context of the problems and make it more real for them. Is that right?
That's exactly right. So, and I actually didn't think about it that way, but that's a very good point. Yeah, I mean, your job when you're pitching investors is to do two things at once at the very beginning, which is educate them if they need to be, which usually isn't the case if you're building a product for other venture-backed companies to build. Like they'll already know what you're talking about. But for us, we need to say, hey, here's how you think about product development within a CPG company. Here is the problem and why it's important and why every single company that looks like this struggles with the same thing. So yes, it was an education on both, just level setting on what the process is to bring a sustainable product to market and also where the opportunity is in there. And once we went through that job map and essentially provide this framework as a basis for discussion, we were able to bring people along with us pretty quickly.
Yeah, and I mean this goes without saying in my brain, but just to make it clear, like you didn't walk out in front of investors and say, well, the job to be done is this, and let me explain to you why jobs to be done is a cool theory. You just explained the customer's goal and their problem. The investors didn't have to know the theory to get the gist of what you were saying, right?
I mean, like anyone, you want to speak the language that they're used to, meet them where they are. So we would start essentially with the highest level. We're not using that language, jobs to be done theory at all, and explicitly trying to avoid being academic about things and saying, hey, we're going to build this thing to solve this problem. So that provided us with like the lowest common denominator of language. And then depending on who the investor was, we could tell a lot of them are familiar with the jobs to be done language. And then we would just dive into it, and say like, oh, if you get this, and you understand some actually like brought up to us like, hey, are you guys talking about jobs to be done here? And then we'd say yes. And then go right into it. Because a lot of investors are product people as well, which is nice.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I wasn't aware that might happen. That's pretty cool. So it sounds like some investors at least responded well to the idea that you had used a framework to really isolate a significant pain point. Is that right?
Yeah. They are looking to us to be the experts on the problem and the problem space, and showing a structure around it demonstrates mastery of that, which gives them confidence that you know what you're talking about.
Right. Have you ever pitched previously to investors, like not using a framework like this?
I have not. This is my first time fundraising, so it was, had to learn a lot in a short amount of time.
Yeah. And you said you raised in a month and a half, is that right?
Yes, we went from starting to fundraise to a term sheet in under 30 days. And then, it takes a little bit more time to get paperwork done. Happy to provide, that sounds great, on the high level. Obviously, there's a lot of iteration in there. And actually related to the jobs piece, we actually got feedback, the first week and a half around, hey, we're not sure who your customer is and what you guys are trying to do. So we actually took a lot of the jobs research we had, because we had talked to 30 or 40 customers previous to fundraising and got a bunch of interest from them and did all the problem mapping. And we explicitly brought all of that, educational jobs opportunity mapping up front to be able to onboard all these investors into our thinking. And that was when we really saw stuff click. And what was nice about that too, Jared, is that when we talk about mapping the problem and then the market size around it, people inevitably would say, oh, have you thought about this competitor? And then we'd say, yes, I'm so glad you asked, because we can map the competitors to saying, hey, are they playing in this problem space or not? And if they are, how do you beat them? Because, we could essentially say we're actually going to go after this first pain point in sourcing and discovering these sustainable materials and being able to map the trade-offs and sustainability and cost, this competitor that you're thinking about isn't even playing in that space. And we think this is a big enough opportunity to go after as a business in and of itself. That's just an example.
Yeah, it's interesting because you could essentially say we're going to position our way to avoid the competitor and not get in a head-to-head with them. Or you could say, if we are getting into a head-to-head with them, here's how customers are going to evaluate that because we understand what problem they're trying to solve, and we think that our solution to this problem will be significantly better.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And that's what I've been focusing on more recently after fundraising, which is, the high level, get the resources you need in order to build a business and execute. And now we need to get a little bit more fine grained in how we're going to get to market. So I've actually been doing a lot more competitive mapping and essentially taking a finer grained look at our initial wedge in compared to the competition and how we're going to tell our story, which again is the same exact work that we started on Jobs to Be Done theory mapping for fundraising, and now we're actually using it in practice on our product roadmap.
I like that. And the reason I like that is because in my own experience with startups and having witnessed other people do it, it can sometimes feel like the work you're doing for investors is parallel to the quote unquote real work of building your product and talking to customers and getting them involved and getting them to use your product. That it's kind of like you have a sales effort to fundraise and then you have a sales effort to actually sell your product, sales and marketing actually. And so it can feel like you have two jobs going on, but it sounds like the framework enabled you to weave those together so that the work you were doing to convince investors was also the work you were doing to gain conviction for you and your team, and also helped you really get specific about what you're building in the product.
Yeah, in retrospect, that was a big learning for us is that, you're taught, depending on who you're talking to, you get different opinions about this, depending on that, but we're trying to constantly evolve our understanding and learn as fast as possible. That's the core advantage we have as a startup is being nimble. And we're talking to investors who, pattern match all day long. So we're getting feedback on our business. And so being able to integrate both product development and feedback from experts into one process was actually really helpful for us. 4 weeks, after we started fundraising, we actually had a way better idea about what it's going to take to build a business we wanted to build. So it was less of let's create a fancy pitch deck that is telling a story to investors, and then we'll simultaneously figure out what we're doing. It was actually the same integrated plan, and obviously we're building at the same time to continue product development. But yeah, I think for us, we were constantly validating our understanding of the problem and opportunity to customers, as well as to investors who can help us think about how to sequence this stuff and validate our solution in solving those problems.
Yeah. So are you going back to the same framework and the same materials that you presented in your pitch meetings now when you're having board discussions about what you're doing?
That is a good question. We're so early in that we don't have regimented board meetings, luckily. We talk to our board members all the time to get feedback, but we are making decisions rapidly we actually had to make a decision, this past week that I think I mentioned before we started the podcast, which was which customer we go after and what product we built for them. Because a lot of the needs we talked about are the same between enterprise, mid-market, and those SMB customers, but the product you build is going to be different because there are surrounding needs and job steps that have different level of fulfillment. For example, there are massive companies that are building really, really specific supply chain software for enterprises, but small businesses obviously have none of that. They don't even know how to start procurement for their own products. Mid-market companies have a lot of vendor relationships, so they don't need help finding vendors. But at the same time, they all struggle with sustainability information in that process. So why, we didn't, in a perfect world, because documentation is difficult in a fast moving startup, we would do exactly what you said, which is refer to that, initial job map in our board meetings and saying, hey, we're making progress on these needs with these customers. Here's our product roadmap. But what we're doing is a little bit more pragmatic given, we have a few people working with us, which is going to our board member and saying, hey, instead of working for the mid-market company and building this product to solve these needs, we're actually going to switch customers, go to small businesses who have the same need, but have the underlying sort of table stakes needs around it that we're going to wrap into a different product. So it has been the foundation for the same discussion. Yes, definitely.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting because in some worlds that would be considered a pivot, but it sounds to me more like just refining your segmentation, right? Like picking a more specific first target customer, but you're going after the same job, the same problems. And so it kind of like takes pressure off of the beauty of your original idea. It's like the idea is no longer your baby. Your baby is the problem you're trying to solve. And you might bring lots of different ideas to bear in order to solve that problem. And you might tweak it based on your target segment that you determine is the best way to go to market. And nobody's, bent out of shape because they had this beautiful idea that they sold to everybody. Everybody's just like, oh no, great. It's a great way to solve the problem. It's a better way to solve the problem. Let's pursue it.
Oh yeah. I mean, some of my co-founders were saying, hey, if you go to our board members and you talk about this quote pivot, what are they going to say? And the answer was go after what customers want and what they need. So it was pretty, you can't really, if you're talking to dozens and dozens of customers, it's hard to ignore what they're asking you for. So yes, this provides us the bullseye to draw creative solutioning around, which is way more creative freedom and like less pressure to get the thing you're building right.
Yeah.
Ultimately, at the end of the day, we knew that the underlying infrastructure that we're going to be building can be applied in a bunch of different ways. And now we have the conviction to say, hey, okay, we're going to go after this, to be specific about it, we're going to go after small, medium-sized businesses who struggle with procurement because they have no relationships. That is our initial wedge in. And then we know we can go after the mid-market companies who have, it's like a clear extension of the problem, just with slightly different product wrapping. So to your point, we're not wed to the solution, we're wed to the problem space and being in the right market, which we have conviction about. And then, it's a go-to-market decision of which wedge you want to enter the market in as a startup versus like, what is your solution, knowing that everything's going to change around you super fast anyway.
Right. You talked a lot about talking to customers, and that's become almost a trope in the past 10 years, I'd say, is as a startup, you got to get out of the building. So how did Jobs to be Done frame the way you approached talking to customers or potential customers?
Yeah, it was really, really important. To my co-founder, Anisha, she came from sustainability and supply chain, from Unilever, and was a consultant for dozens of brands. So she had a great understanding of like where the problems were. But for me, I was like, I need to quickly ramp up on this stuff. I saw it at Glossier, but I don't know the inner workings of like what specifically is difficult about it. So we were hearing from customers, we're talking to seventh generation, talking to Glossier, we're talking to these pre-revenue brands that are, building their product for the first time. And we essentially there was no shortage of where the struggle was, but I just didn't know how to organize it. So if I hear from seventh generation or whatever, Mars or whatever big brand we're talking about, like, oh, we need to validate that we're getting the right data from vendors in order to plug into our carbon accounting software. And then I talk to pre-revenue brands who says, I don't even know what the options for sustainable materials are, if they're actually sustainable, and how I can hear back from vendors.
Right. And what's carbon accounting software?
Right. Yeah. They're not in the business of trying to report carbon numbers to an external authority. They're trying to get their product to market. So in those 30 or 40 or 50 conversations we had initially, I essentially was able to map the problem to, hey, we're talking to this type of customer. Here's what I know about them. They have this much revenue. They care about sustainability in this way. Here's how many product launches they have a year. Here's the job they're doing with all the needs. And then I would structure a conversation around that to say, hey, tell me about this pain point. Is that really a pain point for you? And they'd be like, yes, absolutely. And then they would dive into it, or they'd say, oh, no, it's not. And then I would either have to know that they weren't a target customer or re-evolve my understanding of a job map to create that stable basis to target later. So it was really important. By the end of the 30 or 40 conversations, those job maps, or in other words, the structure around the problem was pretty solidified, combined with Nisha's knowledge about the market. So yeah, this is definitely how people think about it. And we know where the struggle is for each one of these types of
Yeah,
customers.
and that's great. And just for anybody listening, when Jamie talks about a job map, he's talking about, the job to be done is the customer's key goal. It's that thing they're waking up in the morning trying to do, and they wanted to do it before they even knew your company or your product existed, right? And then the map breaks down that goal. It's what do you have to do in order to make that happen. We break the job down into job steps. There's somewhere between 6 and 20, who knows, depends on how complex the job is. And breaking it down helps you isolate when they're complaining. What are they complaining about? And how does it affect their ability to achieve their goal? And is everybody talking about one job step, or are they talking about scattered things, right? Are the pain points collected around a certain part of the job that you can solve in a certain way? So just to break down what a job map is and how to use that.
And just a little bit more color in here. We actually just did this thing, 2 weeks ago. So that initial work we did to structure the job map, I actually went back to those 40 brands and ran a survey to say, hey, I think I know where your struggle is, but can you go ahead and tell me what is, most important in this job and what's most difficult? And we got all of those results back and we're able to segment. We found the segment that had really, really, really gave us a really, really good sense of conviction about where a wedge in the market would be. Say, and within the small business category, there's a certain type of customer who struggles in this one part of the job. And if we know that about them, we know they probably struggle everywhere else. So we're going to focus on them and then do all this other work for them after we build our initial product. So it really helped us get conviction about building the right thing.
That's great. Yeah, and I love that you could see how solving one pain point is a stepping stone on the way to doing a whole lot for the customer. Sometimes you hear startups criticized for being a feature instead of a business, and it's kind of like this framework can defend you against that criticism, because you can say, sure, this is our first feature is going to help with this one specific pain point, which is our wedge in the market, but our sights are set on this larger job that lots of people are trying to do, and we know there's willingness to pay for it.
Yeah, exactly. And that's important for us in particular because we are an impact business. I don't know how much of a background we gave at the beginning, but we essentially are in the business of helping consumer brands prevent carbon emissions, which means that you both have to solve problems for them and you have to also map the opportunity from a carbon emissions standpoint as well. And we actually use the same framework for both, and interestingly. And that helped give conviction to a lot of our partners who are working with us, our CTO, for example, say like, hey, do we really think that this initial feature doesn't sound like a whole lot at the beginning, but I was able to say, hey, this is the opportunity that it unlocks once we get in the door, which is much bigger because we have all these other job steps and needs we can go after once we're in the door.
That's great. So this has been sounds like it's been a huge success so far, Jamie. I'm super happy for you. One thing for anybody out there who's in a similar situation that you are, they're thinking about doing a startup, they are actually fundraising or about to fundraise. Do you have any advice on how to work with jobs to be done if they think that it might be useful to them?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good question because there's, like anything in a startup, you're trying to do it yourself and doing it, do it in a way that's cheap and fast. So this is, almost not helpful advice because this is, like you said, a trope at this point, but you can talk to customers and essentially find the earliest champions who are like, yeah, I want to work with you to build the tool you're thinking about building and solve our problem. I spent a lot of time with a bunch of customers saying, hey, is this the correct job map? Like when you're trying to bring a sustainable product to market, does it first start with this and then go to this and then go to this and then go to this part? That helped when I like co-created the job map with customers. I was able to validate the language and the structure, which is really important because if you're going to be referring back to that map later, you want it to be like more or less correct. I will caution that it's easy to get confused when you're thinking about levels of abstraction. For us, sustainable product development includes procurement, which is a huge space. It includes some communication to customers, also a huge space. So it is helpful to get help from someone who's may have been doing it before, or who can help you resolve some of these levels of abstraction problems. So that I know we talked about this before. Like I like reviewed a bunch of your materials on your website to help me answer some of those questions. And the last piece here I would say is my inclination, I used to work in data, is to get overly quantitative about things. I think just saying like, hey, is something a problem? High level pain, medium level pain, low level pain is going to be good enough to start and even to segment from. Because that's ultimately what you care about as a startup. It's like, are you solving a pain point? It doesn't have to be like the gnarliest pain point in the world, but
Right.
enough to get in the door.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a great point because I often get asked about benchmarks, right? Like, I've identified this job and I've identified what I think is an unmet need in this job. Like, how many people should have it in order for me to go after it? And of course, the answer is it's relative to your business goals, right? Like, if you want, I was going to say lifestyle business, but I kind of hate that term because it's derogatory. If you want to have a really sustainable, long-lasting, profit-generating business that doesn't earn $1 billion, but maybe earns 25 million, and 5 million of those go into your pocket, which would be great. You don't need a $40 billion market, right, or segment. You need a $100 million, right, and you get 25% share in that, or $200 million, right? So that benchmark of how many people have that problem is totally relative to what you need to do for your growth goals today, and that affects your level of abstraction answer. It affects what problems you target. So I think that's important. Like, as a startup, it doesn't have to be in a given job the most painful thing. Now, if people admit it and they're pulling their hair out about it, let's put it this way: it needs to be the most painful thing for a big enough group of people. So if you go to somebody and you're like, hey, do you have this issue? And they're like, well, on my list of 50 things, it's number 49. Right? They're not out there looking for a solution to that, right? You have to do a lot of work to convince them that they should, invest in solving their 49th biggest problem. But you want those people you're targeting to say, like, this is my top 3. But it doesn't have to be everybody in the universe to get going.
Yeah. And that actually aligns quite well with the survey we ran. We essentially had chosen a different customer at the beginning because it was like, oh, they're big. There are a ton of these brands. They have huge budgets. And then we ran the survey and I found that the SMB segment was actually a way larger portion of the market than I thought, with all having the same need. I was like, oh, great. Like, I didn't think that was like a big enough opportunity to be a venture-backed business, but now I do. And that was the basis for us making that choice as a team, and also bringing our investors on board as well.
Terrific. Well, Jamie, this is great. It was really great to talk to you about this. Congrats on your early successes, and good luck with the launches to come.
Appreciate it, Jared. Thanks for having me on.
If you're interested in learning how Thrive can help your company, visit us at thrv.com or email me directly at jared@thrive.com. That's JARED@thrv.com. Thanks for listening.